Hello, fellow Christchurch students, staff, friends of Canterbury Christ Church University. We all want to live a bit more sustainably, right? But that means making informed decisions, and doing research into sustainability can be a bit draining, a bit overwhelming and time-consuming. That's why the sustainability team wanted to do a bit of the work for you, and we asked our very own experts to introduce us into sustainability in these 10 questions.
What is sustainability? Is sustainability about recycling and turning off lights?
So sustainability is one of those words which has emerged in the last 50 years. We didn't really have a word for sustainability until we realised in the 60s and 70s that we had to live within the limits of the planet that we inhabit. And so that's realisation that we were restricted to and had to live within ecological limits has really changed the way that people are thinking. So that's the sort of the background to it. And sustainability is interpreted in lots of different ways, but at a very basic level and a simple level, it's about living within planetary means.
Sustainability as a concept, as a movement, and as an aim has certainly undergone quite a transformation since then, to go beyond conservatism, to include social justice, inclusiveness, and internationalism.
What is sustainability? Well, if you haven't heard, there's a climate crisis. Yep, ever since the Industrial Revolution, mankind has been slowly poisoning the planet we live on. It's big news, you've probably heard of it. Second to COVID, it's probably the biggest thing that's happening in the world right now, and it affects everybody.
There's never a point at which the environment is in crisis. The environment will always rectify itself. It will always, over very long periods of time, find a balance. The crisis is actually a human crisis. It's the way that we're thinking and the way that human beings are behaving. And so a definition which works for me rather better is that sustainability is how we relate to ourselves, how we understand ourselves as human beings and what makes us tick, how we relate to other people. And so that's to do with society and do with community and groups and friendships and all those sorts of things, how we relate to others, and thirdly, how we relate to the world around us.
We tend to look at the world from the perspective of ourselves and see ourselves as the centre of things from which everything else pans out. We see ourselves as independent agents, doing what we will, acting on the world as if the world was simply a stage and basis for our actions. But if we think about the world in that kind of way, we're not going to understand sustainability. So we need to take a different perspective and a different focus. Since the very beginnings of life on Earth, all life has existed as a kind of single ocean, a flow of interconnected life. Not only is life connected together intimately, we're all part of that one flow, but life on Earth is perfectly attuned to the conditions that it finds itself in, whether that be the geology, the rocks, which then contribute to soils, whether that be the oceans and their composition, or whether that be the air we breathe and the atmosphere. There's a kind of intimate interconnection and balance between every species of life and its evolution and the planet on which life has evolved and is still evolving.
But ultimately, I would want to say that it's rather more than turning off the lights or recycling. Useful though that is, and important though that is, it is a much bigger agenda. And talking about the green agenda, building back greener, green this, green party, well, it's a good shorthand. It's very useful. We all need shorthands, but it actually leads us into thinking that it's entirely about looking after the creepy crawlies, looking after the natural world. The natural world will look after itself. We need to get our act together as a species, because actually what we're realizing is we're running up against the buffers and that we're actually causing and heading towards ecological collapse.
This could be highlighted when perusing the United Nations 17 sustainability goals that include diverse ways of achieving sustainability in the world, from eradicating poverty and hunger, access to good health, well-being, clean water and sanitation, to ensuring gender equality, access to quality education, equality and peace. The 17 SDGs are an urgent call for action by all countries and communities, developed and developing, to work towards in a global partnership.
So how is sustainability relevant to me as a, let's say, student of Christ Church?
This is not someone else's problem. The multiple environmental and social injustice crises we face impact all of us. Therefore, to change things around to avoid the disaster we're heading towards is everyone's responsibility. And that makes sustainability relevant to all of us everywhere.
I think there's a really close link between education and sustainability. And there are times that I will talk educationally about sustainability, and sometimes I will talk sustainably about education. I think the important distinctions are to do with my role as a teacher or as a lecturer. And my role, I see, in a world of sustainability is to interrupt my students' thinking, to challenge my students' thinking. The role or the job of my students is whether they accept the gift of my challenge or the gift of my interruption. Because the place I want them to get to, no matter what subject I think you're being taught, the place I would like them to get to would be to think about themselves and what sort of world that they want. But not only for themselves, what is the world that you want going to be like for somebody else? And what is the world that you want going to be like for the planet?
This discussion goes to the heart of what education is about. What should we be learning and teaching? I believe education should help us understand the world we live in. It should help us find our place and role in this world, and it should then help us become able and willing to contribute towards making the world a better place than how we found it.
But what's really important is that when they do make a response, because it will be their world, I will be dead and gone. When they do make a response, that they think about what they want in the future. I sometimes use the word desires, what their desires are for the future, and how those desires match up with other people and the planet. And that is the job of education. If education doesn't do that, then I don't think we're offering a sustainable education. If education is all about providing facts and knowledge and skills, I'm not sure that's a full or a complete education.
This is where our role as students and staff in universities comes in. We need to clearly acknowledge that we need formal as well as lifelong education that will help us realize a sustainable future. And we must actively engage with the world around us. Apathy and disconnection are no longer viable options for us. Theory-informed action should become a central principle of our education.
How can I make a difference?
Making a difference through sustainability is a lot easier than you might think. And the most exciting thing about it is that even really small positive actions or limiting negative actions can make a huge difference in reaching the sustainability goals. There are multiple ways for you to contribute, from simple efforts of being kind to the environment, such as reducing a minute of your shower time, limiting a negative action, to volunteering with a sustainability project at CCCU, a positive action. A good starting place to commence making a difference is to educate yourself about sustainability.
What can we do? Well, as a university, part of our role must be to critically examine the range of issues through environmental change, specifically the slow violence of biodiversity loss and ecosystems decline. Other initiatives include a series of wildflower areas across the campus. These are designed to provide stepping stones for bees and other pollinators. This is very important now in urban areas where small patches like gardens and our green habitats provide a very, very important resource for these insects. And of course, come the autumn, when these plants are in seed, they also provide a very important resource for birds.
There's a sort of lovely phrase from, I guess, from the war, but maybe existed before the First and Second World Wars, to make, do and mend. But it's about being satisfied with, enjoying, rejoicing in the things you've already got, so that we don't need to keep adding to them. If something that you have is perfectly serviceable, if it can be repaired or reused, then don't replace it. Enjoy it for what it is. And the last thing is to realize that we humans and the whole world of nature are intimately locked together in the journey of time. What we do for others in terms of their flourishing, we do for ourselves. And there's a very simple part of moral teaching, which is part of my faith and part of many other faith traditions, which is love your neighbor as yourself. Whether that's another species, whether that's another human being, whether that's a member of your family, that's always good advice.
Does social justice matter for a sustainable future?
Yes, social justice matters for a sustainable future. Since sustainability is about having a fair and just society for all, without social justice, it is not conceivable to work towards a sustainable future or to achieve one. Thus, social justice is the primary focus of sustainability, a just society for human and non-human components of the world.
As J.R. Rahman reminds us, and I quote, the realization that it is not just global warming that we are dealing with, but global warming in an unequal and unjust world has yet to sink in. End of quote. To consider social justice as a separate discussion to discussions about environmental sustainability is to think of human beings somehow being separate or detached from the environment. It is to ignore the relationships and connections between humans and ecosystems. What if we start by acknowledging that we share a planet with the physical, natural environment, but also millions of other species and fellow human beings, and that we are deeply connected as far as the welfare of the planet goes, that our actions impact everything and everyone around us.
Social justice or social sustainability means valuing through real actions human, civil and political rights. It means absence of state oppression, war and violence. It means an income sufficiency, an economy that is sustainable and fair, free and equal access to social care, healthcare and education. It means security in welfare, in food and water, employment and housing. It means a government that is transparent and open, and society where people are free to be themselves, to express their thoughts and their identities, to organize and protest, to pursue activities that are enriching and meaningful. Social justice depends on environmental sustainability.
I would suggest that environmental and social justice are part of the same conversation, because if our values allow us to exploit other people, they will allow us to exploit nature as well. If we put our personal interests ahead of nature, we will also do that for other species and humans on the planet. Environmental destruction, colonialism, discrimination and exploitation based on race, class and gender, for example, are all part of the same discussion.
When a society stops caring for its people, and when it systematically impedes people's ability to meet their basic needs, that relationship breaks down. People stop participating and investing in the society, they lose trust. Now, this can mean an increase in social disorganization and conflict, alienation. And in that situation, further more extreme ways to secure essential but depleting natural resources can become more acceptable, and the risk of environmental degradation increases. A truly sustainable future, therefore, is one where the well-being of people is realized through the well-being of the ecosystem that supports them, and the well-being of the environment is maintained and protected by the people who live in it.
What about economic growth? Can we have sustainable development?
I think if we want to think more deeply about economic growth and sustainable development, one of the difficult questions we have to ask, and it is a difficult question, is what our response is to capitalism. Most people on this planet now are living in systems that are dominated by capitalism. If they're not living directly under that system, then I think I would also argue that most people on this planet, to some extent, are being impacted by the outcomes of capitalism. And it's a really difficult argument because capitalism has brought us immense gains. We have a vaccine now for COVID that we could argue is largely driven because of organisations that are set up to make profit. I work in a lovely university that is set up to make profit. I buy lovely goods from shops that I don't necessarily need, but I want them, and that makes somebody a healthy profit. I think the deep thought we have to have is to think about the unintended consequences of capitalism.
Right, so economic growth has served humanity very well in many ways over the last 300 or 400 years. And you can see that in lots of different ways, but one particularly good way to look at it in terms of life expectancy. Life expectancy today is dramatically better than it was even 100 years ago. And people are living better and longer lives. There's a good argument for saying that people have never had it so good. Our lives globally are better now than for the majority of people than they ever have been. That isn't to say there's not lots of poverty, but the mass famines which used to plague humanity in the past and really are a thing of the past. We can deal with them, and there's no reason why people need to starve. We've got the resources to deal with it. So economic growth has served us well, but the trouble with economic growth is that it involves using lots of resources, it has created lots of pollution, and many economists are now getting to the point where they're saying this is a model that just doesn't make sense. We have to live within planetary limits.
I would go back to Marx, and even back in the 1800s, Marx was writing quite clearly about the impact of industry on the environment, the extraction of resources from a finite planet. And even, he was saying then even that cannot continue. And likewise, he even talked about the way in which workers are being dominated to live their lives due to what capitalism wants. I don't think we can live without it. It would be very difficult to imagine a world without capitalism now, but I think we can think more deeply about the outcomes, and not necessarily the direct outcomes, but the unintended consequences.
And the answer is yes, we can do things better, but we're going to have to do things better very quickly and very dramatically. The danger with sustainable development is that it puts together two ideas which are incompatible. The idea of sustainability, which is a stable state, with development, which is a state of change. And what the value of the term is that it means everything to anybody, but it's actually got what's called ambivalence value, which means it doesn't really mean anything at all because they're two contradictory ideas which are put together in a single phrase. So sustainable development, yes, we certainly want to think about what it could mean, but be very careful not to be misled by the rhetoric, because you could argue that no development can ever really be sustainable, although we can make it much more sustainable. So there's a complicated set of ideas here which are unpacked around a simple slogan of sustainable development. And where this takes us is to say, well, the economic model that we've got at the moment needs to be recalibrated. We are addicted as a society to the notion of progress. No politician could ever get elected at the moment and say we're going to stop growing. The growth of the economy is absolutely fundamental to the way we operate, and yet it is a flawed model. So that's a really interesting point to have got to historically, and it sets off some challenges for the future, which are it's absolutely fundamental that we explore them.
does living more sustainably mean making sacrifices?
We seem to live in a culture which is about having more and more and doing things faster and faster. We live in a culture where politics and economics seems to assume a process of continual and unending growth. Consumer virtue, doing the right thing, seems to be consuming more and more goods in order to help the economy flow. In a culture like that, living sustainably, putting ourselves back into the flow of life, seeing ourselves as part of that flow, is going to feel like making sacrifices. It will seem to mean making do with less. However, what seems to be making do with less might actually improve our quality of life. One of the few upsides of lockdowns has been the ability that people have had to reconnect with nature. Lockdowns have taken away some of that frenetic activity, some of that relentless travelling around, and enabled us to reconnect with nature. I happen to be one of those people who's very fond of trees, so I like getting out into woods. And we know that being in the natural environment, being around trees, is not only relaxing in ways which can be tested and measured, but it's also good for our health. Trees give off particular oils, volatile organic compounds, which help our immune system. So what at first seemed like giving up some of the pace of life actually improves our quality of life and improves our health. From my perspective as a Christian thinker, it seems to me that the God complex which we contemporary human beings have is that we can transcend space and time. And so it is that we prize instant communication and faster travel. But does that ability to be able to do more and more in less and less time make us happier or more content or more compassionate? What do we do with the extra time gained? It seems to me what we do is we just add more and more activity, so we end up chasing our tails even more. So what might seem like sacrifice, what might seem giving up some of the things that we take for granted, might actually surprise us in terms of the return of quality of life. Having space and time for reflection, for relationship, for appreciation of the natural world.
How will Christchurch students and staff be affected by climate change?
So climate change is going to affect us all, but we're not quite certain how, and the effects are going to be unpredictable. At a local level, what we'll notice is certainly changes to the weather and changes to the climate over periods of time. But around the world, we're already seeing bushfires, droughts, more severe hurricanes, and hotter summers, all sorts of things going on, which are the foreshocks of much more significant changes, which we know are going to be in the pipeline and which we are already committed to as a result of past pollution. So climate change will certainly affect the physical basis on which we depend. And the point about it is that it's not going to just affect the weather and maybe cause floods in Canterbury, or maybe we'll get a very hot summer or whatever, but it's also going to affect food production, because plants obviously depend on the weather round about them, and having enough rain, having enough sunshine and so on at the right time of the years. So you can begin to see that it's going to have economic impacts. And those economic impacts are then going to spill over, and are already spilling over, into human lives. So deeply underlying the Syrian conflict, for example, that's been going on for 10 years, was a long-term drought in that part of the world. And it's actually quite significant that the Arab Spring, which again happened about 10 years ago, was triggered by food prices. It was the rising prices of food which people said was unacceptable. So you can see that economically, because we've got a global economic system, that climate change is going to knock the economic system off kilter, and knocking the economic system off kilter has an effect on the way in which people live their lives. And sadly, it looks as if one of the responses which people tend to come up with is to become more extreme, to become xenophobic, to look to self-survival rather than looking outwards towards, well, what can we do as a human community to address these problems? But battling down the hatches isn't going to work, and obviously isn't going to work, although that's a very natural reaction. So coming back to what this means for us in Canterbury, what it means is we need to think about, in the university, about how we can come up with dramatic and imaginative and creative solutions to deal with a crisis which is unfolding in lots of different ways, and to recognize that climate change is part of an interrelated set of problems that involves the decline of biodiversity, which involves the erosion of soils, which involves, in one way or another, pandemics. It's quite possible that the pandemics that we're getting at the moment, because we're getting more and more global pandemics, are being made more likely by climate change. And so what is in the pipeline? We simply don't know what's in the pipeline. It could be health issues, it could be a storm which does terrible damage, or whatever. But climate change has effectively signalled something which, on a geological timescale, makes sense, as it were. For the last 11,000 odd years, we've lived in the Holocene, which is a period of very stable conditions in which human beings have been able to flourish. As a result of pollution and as a result of the way that we've emitted so much CO2 into the atmosphere and other gases, we've effectively evicted ourselves from that stable period. And we're now in a new ecological epoch, which people are beginning to talk about. They're calling it the Anthropocene, the period where human activity has now got geological impact, and we're now in a much more unstable and unpredictable place. And coping with that is one of the challenges for the future, a key challenge.
Is everyone equally responsible for and will be equally affected by climate change?
Not everyone is equally responsible for climate change, and not everyone is equally affected by it either. Of course, individuals contribute to climate change through their routine everyday activities like travel or consumption choices, and sometimes even through illegal activities like burning or dumping hazardous waste. But the main responsibility lies elsewhere. If we look at climate change in terms of contribution to problems, the sheer amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and foreknowledge, so knowing about the consequences of one's actions and going ahead with them anyway, it is very clear that state and corporate level behavior is to blame here. For example, a research study by Heed in 2014 found that between 1854 and 2010, only 90 leading producers of gas, oil, coal and cement were cumulatively responsible for 63% of CO2 and methane emissions worldwide.
Firstly, we are not all in the same metaphorical boat. The rich nations are in large, fancy ships that can face the storm a lot better than the fragile little boats poor people and nations are in. The poorer the communities, the more vulnerable they are to climate change. One estimate suggests that 90% of the costs and 98% of the deaths associated with climate breakdown are faced by people in the global south. Secondly, we are not equally responsible for the mess we face. Let's consider carbon dioxide emissions. Between 1990 and 2015, the richest 1% of the world's population was responsible for more than twice as much carbon dioxide as the poorest 50% of the world. In the same period, the richest 10% of the world's population was responsible for around 52% of global carbon dioxide emissions. The global north is responsible for 92% of all excess global carbon dioxide emissions. Meanwhile, the global south, which disproportionately suffers from the fallouts from climate crisis due to excess carbon dioxide, is responsible for only 8%. And what about energy consumption? 20% of UK citizens are in the top 5% of global energy consumers, as are, for example, 40% of Germans. Compare this to India, where only 0.02%, I'll repeat this, 0.02% of people are in this category. Even the poorest 20% of Britons use over 5 times as much energy per person than the bottom billion in India. The richest 10% of people consume 20 times more energy than the poorest 10%. If you think in terms of transport, the richest 10% people use 187 times more fuel than the poorest 10%. I could go on, but I trust you get the point.
The consequences of climate change, temperature rise, changed weather patterns, increased likelihood of extreme weather events, can all result in resource scarcity and poverty. These exacerbate the existing structural inequalities of wealth and power, acting as a sort of threat multiplier. So, for example, in vulnerable regions and communities that have existing inequalities, history of conflict, already limited resource options, the impact of climate change for people's livelihoods can be really severe. And the consequences can involve displacement of people, political and social instability, perhaps even degradation of human rights. Now, it is important that we don't fall into colonial or racist stereotypes here about the global south and people there, and that we remember that these current inequalities are not somehow natural, but they are a consequence of historical and contemporary global political and economic decisions. So we must not absolve the elite decision makers of responsibility here. And we must not allow climate change to be used to legitimize increased monitoring or surveillance, or any kind of military or other coercive interventions.
Is the natural world really in crisis?
Well, in one sense, no. If we look at the return of nature to disaster zones like Chernobyl, then clearly nature is resilient and humans have very little long-term impact. But of course, the natural world is something we rely on. So yes, the world is in crisis because humans rely on natural resources. We rely on the natural environment to sustain us. And clearly there are issues of ongoing trouble there.
Yeah, I think humans have always had an impact on the natural world, and whether it's always been a negative impact can be debated. I think what's happened in more recent times, and by that I probably mean since the Industrial Revolution, is it's the scale and it's the speed of how humans encroach into the non-human world. So it's the amount of space that's taken up for housing, it's the extraction of resources, including our use of water, that the human impact on the non-human world just seems to have got bigger and gets faster as the years go by.
Yes. When we look at the fossil records from since there is evidence of life on Earth, we can see 5 clear extinction events. And the last one happened about 60 million years ago, and is the one that wiped out the dinosaurs because of the environmental effects of an asteroid. So looking at these records, we also know that is normal, is natural, that 1 in every million species will go extinct. What we see now is an average of something between 10 and 100 times this level of extinction. So we have about 8 million species living today, animals and plants, and 1 million of them are threatened with extinction. So more recently, since the 1970s, we have the Living Planet Index by WWF with very reliable information about the decline of species of plants and animals. And that shows a decline of 68% since 1970 to 2016. That's the records we have. So we can safely say that there is a 6th mass extinction event happening now, and that is not being caused by anything from outside the planet, but very much caused by our destruction of forests, our impact on natural environments because of pollution, because of climate change, and because of bringing species that should not be there to compete or to interact with native species, and because of overexploitation of wildlife and of parts of wildlife for different uses. So all of this contribute to extinction. We can also say that we are the cause then. We are the asteroid now. And if the dinosaurs did not have a choice 60 million years ago, we do. We can make a change. We can change the trend of extinctions and reduce biodiversity loss in several ways. We have to think of our decisions in the way we produce and consume food and energy, and put within the economic plans the value of nature, the value of biodiversity. So before thinking of profit, if we think about the planet, biodiversity and people, we'll be doing a much better job.
The real problem is that human impact on the environment is a form of violence, but unfortunately much of that violence is hidden. When we think about violence, we can think of violence against the person, and it's a very obvious thing, someone being attacked, someone being killed. In the same way, loss of habitat, destruction of hedgerows, forests and so on are very visible, but often they're at a distance from us. We rarely see that, individual issues of violence. They're on the telly, but not in our backyard. One of the real problems here is something which is known as slow violence. It's the way in which, for example, in human populations, exposure to pollution, to toxic chemicals and so on can impact on health over a long term, but it's almost invisible. You can't picture it, you can't create images of it. In that sense, it's not really there. In the same way, the crisis in the natural world is an issue of slow violence. The steady loss of species, the incremental loss of habitats, etc., is driven by processes such as economics, politics, but are so slow that we really don't see the crisis coming on us in a very similar way to the climate crisis.
The context we're living in now and the rate of which large numbers of animals, particularly mammals, fish, the fish in the seas, are decreasing at incredible speeds, such that everyday organisms may well be extinct within our lifetime. And even sitting here, the number of damselflies you would expect around the pond on a day like this would be in the tens. We've got a handful. The number of bees on the buttercups near me, we'd expect again tens. We've got actually none. And I think that is one of the things that's beginning to happen. It's the rate of impact, and it's caused an imbalance in a very delicate ecosystem. And ultimately, it's that ecosystem that provides our food, our clean water. It's that ecosystem that cleans our air.
But how will the disappearance of all of these species affect me personally?
How will the disappearance of species affect me? Well, of course, the disappearance of species will affect us all. We're absolutely reliant on functioning ecosystems to provide our food and other resources. So as these systems start to degrade, as species are lost, eventually these systems will collapse.
So species, first of all, they don't disappear in isolation. Their disappearance is usually the consequence of changes in their natural habitat. So several species will disappear at once. Once a species disappears, it will affect other species because they change the resources, they change the food that is available, or they change the environment.
And people have known about this for decades. One of the best analogies for the loss of species and its impact on us is the rivet popping hypothesis, presented by Paul and Anne Ehrlich back in the 1980s. And they sort of remind us that functioning ecosystems is a bit like an aircraft. It functions very effectively, can fly through the air, and you can take out one rivet from the wing, you can take out another rivet from a wing, and slowly it'll start to have an impact, but we don't really see it, the starting of cracks and so on. But eventually you'll take out one too many rivets, and by that they're talking about species, and the whole structure collapses. And that's perhaps a really good way of thinking about this. It's a slow process, it's one in which we really don't see the damage taking place until it's too late.
Extinction affects the provision of ecosystem services. These ecosystem services go from the production of the air we breathe to the composition of the soils and the plants and animals that we eat, and the genes and the remedies that are created to control of diseases and pollination and the cycle of water and all the chemicals. So every single process in our lives and well-beings depends on services provided by nature. And if we think about nature as the system where each part has its role and cannot be disconnected, it's easier to understand the role of biodiversity loss. So without biodiversity, we have no sustainable future. We actually have no future at all. When we protect, restore, connect nature, and when we bring back species that have been around locally but have gone locally extinct, we are having a positive impact in nature and helping to restore the health of the living system. In the same way, the choices that we can make biodiversity-friendly choices in the way we produce and consume food and fuel and energy in general. So the choices that we make, the political choices and the choices that we make as consumers will also define how much of nature is being protected and impacted in a positive or a negative way. We must consider the value of nature in the decisions that we make at political level and at the economic level, so that we consider life and the planet and nature before we think of profit. In this way, we are contributing to a more equitable and healthy living and society.
A huge thank you to everyone who shared their insights, their research, their opinions with us. And of course, thank you to you for keeping an open mind and wanting to learn more about sustainability. Don't forget that you can always get involved and engage with the sustainability team at Christ Church. Here are some helpful links. And you should definitely follow us on our social media accounts. Here are the handles. You have already taken a few steps towards a more sustainable future just by watching this video and accepted the message. So stay informed, stay involved, and thank you for watching.